Some men lose everything when their wife cheats. Me? I sent her lover a thank you note for taking out the trash. My name is Curtis Garrett. I'm 55 years old, built like the Montana mountains I grew up in, broad-shouldered, thick hands, the kind of man who doesn't waste words or energy. I run Garrett and Company. Builders, a business I built from the ground up after leaving the military. People in Summit Ridge know me. They know I don't bend easy, don't complain, and don't forget. For 20 years, I did things the right way. I worked hard, paid my bills, took care of my family. My wife, Denise, was 17 years younger than me, and I knew going in that we were different. She was soft-spoken, had these ideas about life that didn't always fit with mine, but I figured love was about meeting in the middle. So, I worked and I provided. I thought that was enough. Turns out, Denise needed more. It started small. The kind of things you notice, but don't say out loud. She started staying out later. Her phone suddenly had a password, and there was a new scent on her when she came home. Something clean and unfamiliar. I told myself I was imagining it, that she was just restless. Then one night, I woke up and found her side of the bed empty. I looked out the window and saw her car pulling out of the driveway, taillights disappearing into the dark. I followed. Summit Ridge isn't a big town. There are only so many places a woman can go past midnight. I tailed her, lights off, staying back just enough. She drove past the gas station, past Main Street, out to a motel off Route 78. A cheap one, the kind that tells you exactly what's going on inside. I parked across the lot, sat there in my truck, and watched her step out in a dress I hadn't seen before. Watched as a man, tall, lean, in athletic wear, opened the door and pulled her inside without hesitation. Ryan Whitmore, the physical therapist. The guy who spent months working on Denise's shoulder after she threw it out gardening. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the cold air to sink into my bones. My fingers curled around the steering wheel, but I didn't move. I didn't storm in, didn't cause a scene. That's not how I work. Instead, I let the moment settle, let the truth cement itself in my mind. Then I drove home. The next morning, I made coffee like I always did, poured Denise's the way she liked. Cream, no sugar. She walked into the kitchen looking rested, maybe even lighter than usual. I watched her, let her sit with the weight of my silence. "You okay?" she finally asked, stirring her coffee, not meeting my eyes. I nodded. "Yeah, got a long day ahead." She smiled like nothing had changed, but I saw it now, saw the distance in it. That afternoon, I took a drive down to Whitmore's clinic. I didn't go inside, just parked across the street, wrote a short note, and had one of my guys drop it off at the front desk. "Thanks for taking out the trash. Hope you know broken things aren't easy to fix." That night, Denise came home late again. I sat on the porch, beer in hand, watching the road. When she pulled in, she hesitated before getting out, looking at me like she could sense something was off. I let her sit with it, took another sip, and finally stood up. "Everything good?" she asked, voice careful. "Yeah," I said. "Real good." Then I walked inside, locked the door behind me, and let her stand out there a little longer than usual before I let her back in. The next morning, I was up before the sun, same as always. Made my coffee, black. Made Denise's, cream no sugar. Set it on the counter like I always did. Routine keeps a man steady. She walked in a few minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, wearing one of those soft sweaters she always liked. She hesitated when she saw me, then picked up the mug, testing my face like she was waiting for something. I didn't give her anything. "I've got a long day," I said, rolling my shoulders, feeling the ache that never really left. "Gonna be out on site till late." She nodded, blowing on her coffee. "All right." No kiss goodbye, no lingering look, just an all right. I left, drove to the site where my crew was already setting up. We were putting up a new barn for the Simmons family, a job that should have been done before winter but had dragged out thanks to bad weather. I liked the work, the sound of nail guns, the weight of the lumber, the way a thing started as nothing but pieces and turned into something solid under your hands. It made sense. Around noon, I stepped away, pulled out my phone, and made a couple of calls. First, to Mike. He answered on the second ring. "You never call in the middle of the day," he said. "What's wrong?" I leaned against my truck, staring out at the half-framed structure. "Nothing I can't handle. Just need a favor." He exhaled. "Go on. I need a lawyer. A damn good one." Mike didn't ask why. He and I had known each other too long for that. I'll set up a meeting for tomorrow. You tell me where, and I'll make it happen. Appreciate it. Next, I called a realtor. Told her I had a house to sell. By the time I got home that night, the wheels were already in motion. Denise was in the kitchen, standing by the sink with a glass of wine. She looked up when I walked in, searching my face. I let my boots hit the floor hard, let the weight of me fill the space. How was work? She asked. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped the cap, and leaned against the counter. Productive. She nodded like she was waiting for more. I gave her nothing. I was thinking, she started, tucking a piece of hair behind her ear. Maybe we should go away for a weekend. Just us. We haven't done that in a while. I took a slow sip, let the quiet stretch. She was testing the water, seeing how much I knew, trying to patch something that was already split wide open. I let her sit in it. Can't, I finally said. Too much work. Something flickered across her face. She nodded, forced a small smile. Right. Maybe another time. I let her believe that. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Denise turned onto her side, back to me. Habit. I didn't bother closing my eyes. My mind was already too far ahead, planning the next move, making sure I was the one holding all the cards. By morning, I had a lawyer set, the house listing prepared, and the first cracks in Denise's carefully built world starting to show. The invitation went out on a Monday. Handwritten, personal. Denise's parents, my brother Mike, our daughter Lily, and Ryan's mother, Helen. Just a casual family dinner, I wrote. Been too long since we all sat down together. Denise found me at the kitchen table that evening, reading the paper, her fingers tightening around the invitation. What's this? Dinner, I said without looking up. She hesitated. Why? I turned a page, taking my time. Figured it was overdue. She was quiet for a long beat. I could feel her staring at me, trying to read something in my face, but I didn't give her anything. Eventually, she set the invite down on the counter and left the room. I listened to her walk upstairs, the creak in the third step louder than usual. By Wednesday, everyone had confirmed. I made sure of it. Friday night, I was out on the deck, watching the sun sink behind the trees when Mike pulled up. He climbed out of his truck, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, the way he always did when something was sitting heavy on him. This is either the smartest thing you've ever done, he said, coming up beside me, or the dumbest. I took a slow sip of my beer. Both. He shook his head, looking out at the yard. You sure about this? I nodded. They think they've got a clean escape. I just want everyone to see it for what it is. He sighed, stretching his shoulders. All right. Just tell me if I need to be ready to throw any punches. I smirked. Won't come to that. Yeah, well, never hurts to be prepared. Dinner was set for Saturday at 6. I spent the morning chopping wood, keeping my hands busy. Around noon, I drove into town, stopped by the hardware store, then the bakery. Small talk here and there, same as always. No one suspected a thing. By 5, the table was set. Steak, potatoes, green beans, cornbread. A proper meal. Denise dressed up a little, wore that blue dress I used to like. Maybe she thought this was a truce. By 6, everyone was there. Denise's parents, stiff and polite. Lily, oblivious, but happy to be home from school. Helen Whitmore, smiling softly, unaware she'd raised a coward. Ryan, last to arrive, walking in with a hand on his mother's back like the good son he pretended to be. We ate. Small talk. Weather, work, town gossip. Denise laughed at something Mike said. Ryan looked comfortable, like he belonged here. That wouldn't last. When the plates were cleared, I stood. Picked up my glass, let the room settle. Glad we could all be here, I said. Been too long. Denise smiled. Ryan relaxed in his chair. I reached down, grabbed the manila folder from the seat beside me, and set it on the table. Denise's smile faded. Ryan straightened. Figured since we're all family here, I said, voice steady. It'd be good to put everything on the table. I flipped the folder open, laid out the photos, Denise stepping into that motel, Ryan holding the door open. Phone records, credit card statements. Proof, neat and undeniable. The room went silent. Denise's mother made a small, broken sound, covering her mouth with her hand. Lily's fork clattered against her plate. Helen's breath hitched. Ryan swallowed hard. Curtis. I cut him off with a look. Not your turn to talk. He shut his mouth. Denise's face drained of color. She looked at me, eyes wide, desperate. Curtis, I didn't let her finish. No need to explain. I turned to Ryan's mother. Helen, I'm sorry you had to find out this way. She looked at her son, pure disappointment on her face. Ryan, he stammered, reaching for her hand, but she pulled back. I looked back at Denise. You're free now, I said, voice calm, steady. Hope it was worth it. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked at her parents, who wouldn't meet her eyes. Mike exhaled slowly. Jesus, Curtis. I shrugged. Just figured everyone deserved to know. Then I picked up my drink, took a sip, and let the silence stretch. Denise sat there, frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table like it might hold her up. Her father wouldn't look at her. Her mother had gone stiff, eyes locked on the papers spread across the table like someone had just laid out a body. Ryan was the first to break. He shifted in his chair, adjusting his collar, glancing around like he was looking for an exit. Curtis, I don't know what you think you saw, but I let out a short, humorless laugh. I saw plenty. Got the receipts too. You want me to pass them around? His jaw clenched, and for a second, I saw the fight in him. But he wasn't built for it. Not like me. He looked away first. Denise finally moved, reaching out toward me like she thought this was something she could still talk her way out of. Curtis, please, we need to. No, I said, standing. We don't. Her voice broke a little. It wasn't like that. I pushed the chair back under the table, slow and deliberate. It was exactly like that. Lily's voice was small. Mom. Denise flinched. It was one thing to face me, another to face our daughter. She turned to Lily, eyes pleading. It's complicated. Lily stared at her like she didn't recognize the woman sitting across from her. No, it's not. Helen looked at her son, shaking her head, disappointment thick in every line of her face. Ryan. My God. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his confidence draining by the second. Mom, don't, she cut in. Not tonight. Denise's father finally spoke, voice low, tired. We raised you better than this. Denise flinched again, eyes going glassy. Mike, sitting at the end of the table, exhaled and rubbed a hand over his jaw. Well, hell of a meal, Curtis. I nodded. Glad you could make it. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what to do next. The air was thick with it, that realization that nothing was going to be the same after tonight. Denise turned to me again, quieter this time, desperate but measured, like she thought if she could just get me alone, she could fix this. Can we talk? I looked at her, held her gaze just long enough for her to understand. We're past that. Her chin trembled, just a little, but she swallowed it down. Ryan pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. I should go. I smirked. You should. Helen stood too, slower, her disappointment weighing her down. She turned to me, her voice soft, regretful. Curtis, I shook my head. Not your fault. She gave me a sad nod, then walked past Ryan without a glance, out the front door. He followed, shoulders hunched, tail tucked. Denise stayed sitting, staring at her hands, looking like she was trying to figure out what move to make next. I saved her the trouble. Divorce papers will be on the table by Monday. Her breath hitched, and she finally looked at me. Curtis. Don't. Silence stretched again. Then she nodded once, stiff, resigned. Lily stood next, slow, like she wasn't sure if she should even be here anymore. She turned to me, hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged me, quick and tight. I patted her back. I'll call you later, she mumbled. I'll be here. She left without another word. Mike stood, sighing like he was feeling the weight of it himself. Need me to stay? I shook my head. I'm good. He nodded. All right. See you Monday. And then it was just Denise and me. She finally stood, brushing her hands over her dress like she could smooth the night away. She looked around, like she didn't recognize the house anymore. Maybe she didn't. I never wanted to hurt you, she said finally, voice quiet, almost rehearsed. I let that sit for a second before responding. You just didn't think I'd do something about it. She didn't answer. I walked past her, grabbed the stack of plates from the table, and headed for the sink. She stayed there for another moment, then finally turned and walked upstairs. I heard the bedroom door close. By morning, I'd have a lawyer on the phone, and by the end of the week, Denise Garrett would no longer have a home in this house. By Monday morning, I was sitting in my lawyer's office, a small place on Main Street with dark wood furniture and the smell of old paper hanging in the air. Mark Reynolds had handled business contracts for me over the years, a no-nonsense guy who didn't waste time. He flipped through the paperwork I brought in, nodding every few seconds, then leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk. You want this fast? He asked. I nodded. Clean and done. She gets nothing. He rubbed his jaw. House is in your name. Business too. Only joint asset is the checking account, and that's mostly your money. He flipped a page. You're in a good position. I already knew that. I built my life with my own hands. The only mistake was thinking I could trust someone to share it. Mark sighed, sat up straighter. She could fight for spousal support. I let out a short breath. She can try. He smirked. I'll make sure she doesn't get far. By the time I left, the papers were drawn up, ready to be served. That evening, I got home, found Denise sitting on the porch, arms wrapped around herself like the cold had just started to bother her. She looked up when I stepped out of my truck, eyes searching mine. I got your message, she said, voice careful. Good. I walked past her, heading for the door. She stood quickly. Curtis, wait. I paused, one hand on the handle, but didn't turn around. I don't want this to turn ugly, she said. I let out a breath, slow. It turned ugly the minute you stepped into that motel. She flinched, but didn't look away. We had problems, Curtis. I finally turned, met her eyes. Yeah, and you solved them by screwing Whitmore. Her lips pressed together, but she didn't deny it. I shook my head. You think if you stand out here looking sorry enough, I'll change my mind? She swallowed. I don't know. I don't know how we got here. I stared at her for a long moment, then stepped closer, keeping my voice level. We got here because I spent 20 years building a life with someone who didn't respect it. We got here because you thought I'd never find out. We got here because you chose to put yourself first. So don't stand here acting like this just happened. Tears welled in her eyes, but I wasn't about to soften. You can sign the papers or fight me in court, I said. Either way, you're leaving. She wiped at her face, nodding quickly, then turned and walked back inside. I stayed out on the porch, listening to the wind cut through the trees. 2 days later, she was gone. I came home to find her side of the closet empty, drawers half open like she'd left in a hurry. The only thing she took from the kitchen was her coffee mug. The bed looked untouched, a half-life abandoned in a handful of bags. I stood in the middle of the bedroom, looking around, and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just a space that finally felt like mine again. At work, my crew knew something was up, but no one asked. They worked hard, heads down, the way men do when they know another man is dealing with something but doesn't need to talk about it. Earl, my foreman, just clapped me on the back the first morning, handed me a coffee, and said, "Ready to get back to work, boss?" And that was that. The town took sides quick. Ryan's clinic got quieter by the week. People talked. The kind of talk that makes businesses dry up and reputations rot. Denise tried staying in Summit Ridge at first, but she must have realized real fast that people weren't welcoming her with open arms anymore. By the time the divorce was finalized, she was gone. The house sold in less than a month. I didn't stick around to watch the new owners move in. Instead, I packed up what I wanted and signed the deed over. Then I drove out to the lake, to the cabin I'd bought off a retired forester, and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the clean, sharp air. It was small, nothing fancy, but solid. Built to last. That night, I lit the fireplace, poured a drink, and sat in the quiet, knowing that for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The first few weeks at the cabin, I kept busy. Work was steady, the crew running like a well-oiled machine, and the days had a rhythm I liked. Wake up before sunrise, coffee black, drive to the job site, work hard, come home tired in the best way. No noise. No uncertainty. Just things that made sense. Mike came by one afternoon, pulled up in his truck and stepped out, holding a six-pack like an offering. He looked around, taking in the place, nodding to himself. Hell of a setup, he said, walking up the porch steps. It'll do. He handed me a beer, twisted open his own. You hear? I already knew what he was talking about. In a town like Summit Ridge, you don't have to go looking for news. It finds you. She's leaving for good, he said, confirming it anyway. Denise had lasted 2 months before the cold shoulders and side eyes got to be too much. I heard she tried to start over at the salon she used to go to, but her old friends weren't in the mood for small talk. People had their own opinions about what she'd done, and most of them weren't forgiving. Where's she going? I asked, because it felt like I should. Bozeman, I think. Got some cousin out there. Mike took a slow sip. Whitmore's shutting down his clinic. Packed up last week. I nodded, staring out at the lake. Figures. Yeah. He let the silence settle, then shot me a sideways look. You feel anything about it? I considered that for a second, rolling the bottle between my fingers. Not much. Mike smirked. Figured. We sat there for a while, drinking in easy quiet. He didn't push, and I didn't offer more than I had to. That's how it always was with us. Work kept rolling. New projects, new clients. The Simmons barn got finished before the first snow, and we had 3 more lined up before the end of the year. My name carried weight in Summit Ridge. A man who built things right, who kept his word. That didn't change just because my wife turned out to be someone I didn't recognize. Then came the night of the community banquet. I wasn't planning to go. Never had much patience for town events. All handshakes and polite conversation. But Earl's wife got sick last minute, and he called me up saying he had a spare ticket, that it'd look good if I showed up. So I went. The banquet hall was packed, round tables covered in white cloth, people dressed a little nicer than usual. I kept to the edges, nodding at familiar faces, grabbing a drink from the bar. Then I saw her. Sarah Hastings. Owned the hardware store, ran it after her old man retired. Sharp mind, knew how to talk business, and wasn't one for gossip. I'd known her in passing for years, but we never talked much beyond the usual pleasantries. She was standing by the dessert table, listening to some old-timer drone on, looking like she was considering whether the lemon bars were worth the conversation. I walked over, leaned against the table. They any good? She glanced at me, then the tray. Probably stale. I smirked. Figures. The old-timer wandered off, and she folded her arms, tilting her head. Didn't think I'd see you here. Didn't think I'd come. She considered that, then nodded toward my empty glass. Need a refill? I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't soft. She wasn't looking for an angle. Just a woman who ran a business, same as me. Yeah, I said finally. I think I do. And just like that, the night got a little more interesting. Winter came fast that year, biting and sharp, the kind that settled deep in your bones. Work didn't slow down. If anything, it picked up. The new barn outside town, renovations on the old mill, a few home additions before the snow made everything harder. It kept my hands busy, kept my mind where it needed to be. Denise was gone. Finalized. Done. She left a signed copy of the divorce papers on my lawyer's desk before packing whatever was left of her dignity and heading for Bozeman. Last I heard, she found a job at a real estate office, probably trying to reinvent herself in a town where people didn't know her history. Ryan was long gone, clinic shut down, property sold. No one cared where he ended up. Some people whispered that he ran back to the city, tried to start over, but no one in Summit Ridge gave a damn. Lily came home for Christmas break, pulled up in her little car, looking like she'd put on a few more layers of confidence since she left. She walked into the cabin, took one long look around, nodded. This suits you. I gestured at the fireplace. Better than that old house. She dropped her bag by the door. No argument there. We kept things simple. No long talks about the past. No revisiting the mess. She didn't ask about her mother, and I didn't bring it up. She was old enough to know how to deal with things in her own way. You seeing anyone? She asked over dinner, eyes sharp like she thought she'd catch me off guard. I took a slow sip of my drink. Maybe. She smirked. Sarah? I raised a brow. That your business? She shrugged, but there was something satisfied in her expression. I like her. She doesn't take shit. Good quality, I said. Sarah and I had been keeping it simple. Coffee at the shop, the occasional drink after work, a few nights at her place when things lined up right. No expectations, no complications. She ran her business, I ran mine, and we met somewhere in the middle. It worked. 2 weeks later, I was in town, grabbing supplies when I ran into Father Thomas outside the diner. He was bundled up against the cold, hat pulled low, but he still had that same tired look, like he'd seen too much of the world to be surprised by any of it. He gave me a long look, then nodded toward the lumber in my truck. Still building. Always. He rubbed his hands together, watching me like he was turning something over in his head. You did it right. I didn't say anything. Just let the weight of those words settle. He sighed, shaking his head. Some men let bitterness rot them from the inside. You didn't. Didn't have the time for it, I said. He let out a quiet chuckle, then glanced toward the sky, his breath fogging in the cold. Good to see a man stand his ground and walk away stronger. I nodded. That's the only way to do it. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, solid and firm, then walked inside. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the lake turn to glass under the moonlight, the cold sharp and clean. The past was done. The weight of it gone. The town knew where I stood, and the people who mattered stuck around. Some men let betrayal break them. Me? I built.